Good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Johns. I work for the Building Community Trust, and welcome to the second in our series of events on the cost of living crisis and action that is being undertaken at community level. This one, as you can see, obviously about well-being and the impact that the cost of living is having on people's mental health, and the different actions that can be taken to address that. At community level, and we're doing this in conjunction with Community Movement Cymru, which I'll talk about a little bit in a moment. Just a couple of bits of background before we start. The event is being recorded, so we can share it with others. If you have any issues with this, please send us a private message on the chat. And we'll try and edit anything you say out if that's necessary. Please stay on mute unless you're speaking. But we'd really welcome questions and contributions, both after the speakers have done and also during the group chat afterwards, which is a really important opportunity to both explore further issues from this and also to share what you are doing and find out what others are doing. My colleague Mark is handling all the technology issues, so if you have any problems, please send him a message and he'll try and help you. One thing we are doing at all of the events, just sharing a bit of information about Community Movement Cymru, which is a relatively new network for community organisations. It's a chance to bring organisations together across Wales. There is no forum quite like this at the moment, and the main purpose is for networking like this to just share practice and ideas. And we've been doing this as BCT for a little while now, but we're trying to encourage more and more community organisations to share what they're doing and take up the opportunity to learn what people in different parts of the country are doing. But also to influence policy. There was an interesting discussion in the Senedd yesterday about the importance of community action in tackling well-being, and indeed one of the ministers talked about their emerging communities policy. But without community organisations talking very loudly and clearly about what they're doing, and to be honest, having a bit of a go at Welsh Government for not having a community policy in the past, I don't think we'd have these steps forward we're seeing now. So it's really important that voice of community organisations comes through loud and clear at both local and national level, which is one of the main reasons for Community Movement Cymru's existence. So any of you who are interested in being part of it or find out more, please get in touch. Mark again will post a link in the chat if you want to find out more or come to one of the meetings, or just stay in touch and get invited to events like this. One of the other things we're doing at all of these events, we'll post details in the chat, is just promoting a little bit of the help that is available for individuals. A lot of it is coming through directly into people's bank accounts, and some of you will have seen that yourselves already. Certainly I have off my fuel bill. But there is also a few schemes that need to be applied for. We will again post links into this. Many people will know about the Welsh Government fuel support scheme, but people do have to apply for this, and they can apply for it up until the end of the winter. But it is there to provide a direct cash payment from their bills. It'll come through every local authority, but they're called something slightly different, but the same idea is the same. But the other thing that's probably less well known is Welsh Water actually having help with bills. Water bills may not be going up, but people's ability to pay them is going down as other bills go up. So this is a way of actually helping people make life slightly more affordable. So this is a scheme that's worth promoting with people you know. Discretionary Assistance Fund is the final one, which is probably more well known for people who work with welfare and benefits, but there is some emergency help available through the government for essential costs. So just worth promoting those locally if you get the chance. So I'm going to come on to our main speakers now, which is the main purpose of the day. Emma Gooding is going to talk to us first. She's a policy and communications manager at Samaritans Cymru, and Samaritans played a really important role over the last few years in demonstrating really clearly the links between mental health and well-being and inequality and poverty. And that has never been more relevant than today. And the Samaritans insights are really important to us understanding what's going on with people's mental health. So I'd really like to take this chance now to welcome Emma, who we worked with Samaritans before in the past and found that a really constructive experience. And I'm sure you're going to bring a lot of insights for this debate. So I've stopped sharing now, Emma. So we're over to you to kick off this next part of the discussion.
Thanks, Chris. And yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. We've really valued working with Building Communities Trust in the past. And yeah, this is a very, key strategic area for us. So let's see if I can share my screen. I've probably overshot how much I can fit in 10 minutes. So I may ramble a little bit. So apologies in advance.
You've probably got a bit.
Oh,
don't worry too much.
Can everybody see that?
Not yet.
No.
There can be a delay sometimes.
Okay.
What's it saying?
It just did an error message. Hold on, let me try again. Has it worked that time?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, hoping now everyone can see the screen and not me. Is that right? Okay. So yeah, just a little bit of background. I'm sure everyone knows who we are, but we work locally and nationally to raise awareness of our service and reach into local communities. Overall, we exist to reduce suicide in Wales. Just a brief overview, just to give it a bit of context. In 2021, there was 347 suicides registered in Wales. 76% of those were men and 24% were women. That's quite standard. As in, men in Wales are around 3.3 times more likely to die by suicide than women. And the latest stats show that men aged 45 to 49 are the age group with the highest suicide rate. It's obviously a rare event, but each suicide has a really wide impact on friends, family, and communities, and survivors of suicide loss are at higher risk of developing suicidal thoughts themselves. It's a really unique grief, and we should be geared up to support those bereaved by suicide in communities. So what we're here for, obviously, it's a major public health issue, but there's probably less out there detailing the ways in which it's a major inequality issue, and it disproportionately affects those experiencing poverty. Some top line statistics: suicide rates are 2 to 3 times higher in the most deprived areas compared with the most affluent. People who've experienced adverse childhood experiences, so experiencing violence or growing up with instability, such as parents experiencing substance misuse or mental health problems, they're at much greater risk of mental illness throughout their life and subsequent suicide risks. So adults who've suffered 4 or more types of ACEs are almost 10 times more likely to have self-harmed or felt suicidal than those who've experienced none. And of course, as many people here are aware, ACEs are more common in those who've grown up in poverty. Some very, core focus data for us is that we are seeing, not surprisingly, a gradual increase in calls and emails from people who are worried about their finances. And although we say gradual, that's because we're looking at the last 2 years. But August, as in just gone, was the highest monthly proportion of calls we've had on finances in at least 5 years. And really, it's probably one of the highest we've ever seen. And we're obviously not putting that in the press, but it's a real concern. So since the start of this year through to August, over 100,000 contacts have mentioned finance. Suicide is really complex, but other risk factors include history of depression, criminal legal problems, current or prior history of ACEs, high conflict or violent relationships, substance misuse, and job and financial problems or loss. We know that some of these risk factors are more common for those living in poverty, and this presents a very problematic cycle of inequality. So back in 2018, we launched a report called Socioeconomic Disadvantage and Suicidal Behaviour, and we actually worked with BCT on this, where we did a policy roundtable. But the report included some UK research commissioned by Samaritans And just to run through some top line findings, I haven't listed them all here. There's a really strong association between area level deprivation and suicide. As area level deprivation increases, so does suicidal behaviour. Admissions to hospital following self-harm are 2 times higher in the most deprived communities. Individuals experiencing poverty and adverse experiences such as unemployment or unmanageable debt are at increased risk of suicide behaviour, particularly during periods of recession. There's a very strong link between recession and suicide rates, so we're very concerned at the moment. The risk of suicide is increased amongst those facing job insecurity or downsizing, but also those engaged in non-traditional work situations, so part-time, irregular or short-term contracts. The experience of being declared bankrupt, losing your home, or not being able to repay debts to family or friends is not only stressful, but can feel humiliating. And that's one of the psychological factors linked with suicide risk, which I'll get onto in a bit.
Emma, so start in. We can only see your first slide. Are you clicking through the slides?
Oh yeah, that's no good, is it? Are you still just seeing my name?
No, we're seeing PowerPoint.
But
When
just
you shared your screen, did you share just the presentation, or because I think if you shared the screen that didn't have the presentation on it, may not have come through.
yeah, that's moved now. Yes.
Right. Okay. So I was.
Yeah, there we go.
Sorry about that. I will circulate these slides anyway.
Thank you.
The perils of online presenting. Okay. Yeah. So where was I up to? Yeah. So I've run through some of the top line findings. The last one there was people in poverty are less likely to seek help for mental health problems than the most affluent. They're less likely to be referred to specialist mental health services following self-harm by GPs located in deprived areas as well. So the pandemic and cost of living crisis has obviously widened inequalities for many people in Wales, and those who were identified as vulnerable at the beginning are now facing even higher levels of distress than ever before. Just some central research that's currently going on. High levels of inflation impact everyone as the prices of household necessities like energy and food increased. But this impact isn't equal, as we know, and people with the lowest levels of income will be hardest hit. And we know that people in this group are already at higher risk of suicide. So people amongst the poorest 10% of society are more than twice as likely to die from suicide as the wealthiest 10%. And the reasons for this go obviously beyond the current crisis, which is important. And it covers a wide range of issues. But the cost of living crisis will put further pressures on people who already are at greater risk of suicide. So this cycle of inequality is really important. Hoping you can see my next screen. Psychological factors. Okay.
Yeah.
So within our research, we commissioned different leading experts on suicide prevention and public health to author different chapters. And there was one by Professor Rory O'Connor, and he did a chapter on psychological factors. And we at Samaritans, this is a really important one for us. We're obviously not experts in poverty, but we do know many of the powerful emotions experienced by people living in poverty increases the risk of suicide. So just some of these words I've put on here, they were all referenced within the report. So exposure to negative life events, particularly involving loss, bereavement, that heightens the risk of suicidal behaviour. So all this childhood adversity is obviously going to result in those sorts of emotions. Rumination, individuals experiencing poverty, they're more prone to rumination, as in automatic and compulsive thoughts, which focus on the symptoms. And that's quite apparent, because if you can't get out of your situation and there is no way out, there's nothing else to do but ruminate. And just to flag there, which I keep saying, I get asked a lot of questions about whether we're in a mental health crisis and why there's such a rise in depression. And we at Samaritans, we're really focused on public mental health, and the rise in depression, we think it's really important not to medicalize emotional distress. And actually a lot of people experiencing increased depression and anxiety, it's actually a natural response to very hard times. And And there's a lot thrown out about people being more resilient or more positive, but it's very difficult to be resilient if you've got no food or, you know, a warm house. So it's really important to just focus on that. Feelings of shame and humiliation related to financial circumstances, the feelings of being defeated or trapped are common amongst those experiencing poverty, and that increases the likelihood of suicidal thoughts. The sense of being a burden is a really important one. You know, people who feel suicidal often feel that people would be, you know, better off without them. That's been consistently associated with suicidal behavior, as well as implicated in the self-stigma. So how people think others will view them if they're experiencing poverty. A really important point at the bottom, I had a discussion with the chair of the Anti-Poverty Coalition this week, of which we're members, and Child Poverty Action Group are doing some research on the well-being of children and young people in schools. And I hope I described this correctly, but they found that poverty is the biggest indicator of low well-being in pupils, but it's much worse when pupils are in settings where there's a wider gap between themselves and other pupils' backgrounds. So if a child is in a school where many of their peers are from a similar background, even if they're experiencing higher levels of poverty, their well-being is not as poor as a child living in that same level of poverty, but alongside more affluent pupils. And I think that's really important because it shows the effect of relativity and how feelings of shame and humiliation must arise. So we support a lot of calls to try and minimize the amount of exclusionary practices in schools, such as, I mean, they're endless, aren't they? But non-uniform days, children in need donations, etc., because it's really hard and stigmatizing for those who can't afford it. And this plays out for adults too. It's humiliating to access support if your friends don't need it. And overall, we just shouldn't minimize how important those psychological factors are, both for adults, and obviously we also focus on children to protect against future suicide risk, because those feelings that arise at childhood are carried with children throughout their lives. And often another big core focus of our work is school exclusion, and a lot of children and young people excluded from school are living in poverty. And it's just, again, I broke a record, but it's back to that cycle of inequality. So in terms of what can we can do, we had 10 recommendations in our report, and I'm only picking out some, and I can share that report and these slides, obviously. It goes without saying that people need more money, and that sits with the UK government, and there's work going on centrally to address that. But there's obviously things that Welsh Government and leaders across Wales can do in terms of meaningful steps. I've talked with Chris a number of times, but we still believe that we need a centralised strategy for poverty, which promotes cross-governmental and cross-sectoral involvement. And we think that's so important for such a major public health issue. We need one that mitigates the impact of poverty on individuals and communities, but sits along economic strategies. Making an intervention with ACEs is really important. I think a big part of that is just awareness. So our evidence shows us that ACEs increase the likelihood of poor mental health, lower educational achievement, lower economic success, substance misuse, contact with the criminal justice system. All of those are high risk factors for suicide. So it's just, there's so many elements which affect suicide risk altogether. Intervention to reduce ACEs can have a major effect on health and poverty, and must be developed and promoted through public and professional awareness. Community groups and outreach is a form of prevention, early intervention. From engaging with communities, we know that's really important. Loneliness and isolation is another risk factor for suicide. And again, being socially isolated, it makes people more vulnerable to suicidal thinking, but low social support and disconnectedness is a feature of poverty as well. So, you know, we've been discussing in the Alliance recently, we've heard that there's an increase in loneliness amongst parents because it's becoming, you know, we've hit winter, there's less free, you know, you can't go outside. If the park's your only free, you know, outlet, you're not going to take your child to the park in this weather. So the people, you know, there's nowhere else to go. So investment in those sorts of groups are really important. And we've always said that community groups should be seen as a form of prevention for suicide. Mental health and suicide awareness training, this is a really key one. We need to, this sounds really obvious, but we need to be where people in distress are. And quite often that's not GP surgeries or A&E. it is food banks, job centres, local community centres, and those staff. We're all too aware that those staff are often volunteers or grassroots, and they are put upon. We know that, and therefore the investment in training, it needs to be paid for. It needs to come from somewhere. It needs to be, managed well. But in terms of that suicide awareness training, it can just empower staff to be able to deal with, know where to signpost and feel more confident. There's definitely, we know and understand that there's a reluctance to talk about suicide. If someone comes up to you and says, I'm suicidal, it's very daunting and can be frightening. We understand that, but suicide training can really help in that way. And alongside that, they also need to have access to support themselves. So we know there's training packages. Samaritans obviously do packages like this where we can do awareness training on how to support, people you're coming in contact with, but also how to look after yourself. And then there's the obvious ones, which I sort of referenced, but poverty and vulnerability must be destigmatized, and we must have a compassionate approach to poverty. So we think that the attitude surrounding poverty, it's hard to shift, but we need to target the us and them attitude. So we try and work with we've tried to do awareness sessions with the press and public figures about how recognizing the impact of stigma and avoiding language which portrays poverty in a way that increases stigma, try to avoid that. And overall, one of the core values of Samaritans is compassion, but we're just aware that no one wants to be a service user or a client, and poverty and inequality are integrally linked, and it's essential we treat people living in poverty with fairness and respect. And a lack of communication skills or financial literacy or mental health issues shouldn't mean that a missed appointment puts individuals back to the sort of lengthy processes and waiting lists. It's things like that. So a whole system approach which instills that compassionate approach, it should be embedded in the systems, lots of systems across Wales. So finally, this is just a key ask of the Anti-Poverty Alliance, but we need dignified anti-poverty support. And I know that many people here will be excelling in doing this or know of places that are doing that, but we need new and innovative ways of delivering support, such as cash support instead of food vouchers, or one-stop shops where someone in distress and living in poverty can access priority support, such as financial advice, emotional support, access to food, all under one roof. We know those things can make a really big difference to someone's well-being. And just to say, we're always learning at Samaritans, and whilst this is a really core area of work, in terms of what works on a community level, we're really keen to hear the different ways that people are delivering this kind of support, and we would really welcome a discussion. And I mentioned in our last meeting, we've just, they started 3 weeks ago, but we now have a dedicated community influencing manager in Wales. So they're trying to work with communities to sort of deliver suicide prevention on a local level that actually works. So there's lots of opportunities to increase this scope of work. So I think I probably did that in time. I'm sorry if I rambled, but yeah, really welcome any discussions or questions. Thank you.
Unmute myself. Thank you, Emma. That was great. Lots of really interesting stuff. And I have to say, as BCT, we would thoroughly support those recommendations that you made at the end. And just to confirm, we will circulate Emma's slides to everybody who signed up for today's workshop. There's lots of useful things there. I don't know if people have got questions or comments from what they've just heard that they'd like to come forward with. While we're just waiting, then can I come in with one question, Emma, which is how might I know a lot of people here are involved in community level activity. How might the new post you've got, your community engagement manager, work with local community organisations?
There's not an easy answer to that question, and it's a good one, really. It's good that I don't have the answers. It's a funded project, and it's really up to the community influencer manager to work that out. So there's no confidence to this role. So it's a brand new project, and the reason we bid for it is because we're obviously part of all the suicide prevention forums, the regional ones, the local ones, but a lot of people around the table in those meetings that are more high level are, NHS or local leaders, etc. But we're not always aware of what actually works in terms of local suicide prevention on the ground, and how we meet people in most distress, and how we make sure we've got adequate signposting in those places. So basically, I can share the contact details of Bryony. She's only just started, but I think she's just very keen to map out what support is out there and where the gaps are and what doesn't work in terms of referrals, signposting. So yeah, that might not be useful, but it is a brand new project. So I think the scope is endless really, but we know that we need to be much deeper in local communities to make a difference.
Right, okay, thanks. Obviously, we don't want to swamp Bryony with work in her first couple of weeks in the job.
Yeah, she's very keen to sort of have those initial meetings though, because I think she's come in and is wondering where she can start. So she'll probably be looking at pilot projects, or, I know me and you, Chris, talked about the idea of doing a one-stop shop as a pilot in an area or something. So she'll be the one to be involved in that. So yeah, it's exciting.
Great, okay, thanks. Sorry, I've monopolised my position as chair. I'm sure there'll be other people with comments or questions.
I'll hop in for a second. In terms of the work around sort of suicide prevention, obviously you see a lot of sort of signs on bridges and stuff like that, and at train stations. Is there evidence that that stuff is working and effective, and is there more of that stuff in communities which are more affected by people taking their own lives?
You'll regret asking me that question. It's a really big part of my work. But in order for there to be a sign on a bridge or a car park, etc., there's quite a strict set of rules on that. So there has to have been 2 or more suicides in a year to make it a high frequency location. That's what it's called. So yeah, I don't know what the evidence is around whether there's more of those signs in areas of poverty. I'm not sure. I mean, they tend to be bridges. So we have to be really careful, because if we over swamp the bridge with signs, then it can have the opposite effect of sort of advertising it as a site to very vulnerable people. But overall, there's a lot of powerful evidence on the effectiveness of signs on certain bridges, structures, locations. Yeah, but I mean, what I'd say there is that where suicide prevention can be increased, and I'm sure, yeah, Chris knows I speak quite openly, sometimes if there has been an identified suicide high frequency location, so say there's been 4 off a certain place in a year, some people will ask us for signs, put the signs on and think, well, that's the job done because we put the signs there. But actually what needs to happen is you need a multi-agency group to come together and be like, really good places. I appreciate it's budget restraint, but ones that do it well will sort of explore CCTV at that location and link in with the police. They'll sort of try triaging projects, or they'll consider the use of nets or heightening the barriers, which is all expensive, but it's sometimes they'll ask for our signs and think, well, that's us done. And also, interestingly, there's also, the evidence is less limited, but we know anecdotally it's really well received. When there's been an increase in suicide attempts or a certain area, we'll sort of work with the community to place help-seeking pieces in the papers. So it won't reference a suicide, obviously, but it'll just be like how to look after your well-being, or the importance of connection, or the importance of talking about how you feel, because it's just trying to sort of encourage the local authority to reach out in any way they can, other than using signs. I could go on about that for a really long time.
In my last job, I used to work as a volunteer coordinator, and I worked with the PCSO in Llantrip Major, and the signs aren't like the be all and end all, but there's also challenges around sort of land ownership and stuff like that. I remember finding that as well. So I know it's not the thing that will make all the difference, but I know that there is evidence that goes with it. There is a question in the chat from Lisa Ridley. she's asked, really interesting to hear how the power of language impacts on this. Is there something organisations can do in how we can communicate without causing further stigma?
Yeah, Emma, do you want to come on to that and also ask other people want to contribute on this? 'Cause it's a much broader question than just about suicide, but you'll probably have a view on this to start with.
Well, I'd be really interested to hear what other people have to say. I'm sure there is, a guide or something people could use. We've got a free resource called Working with Compassion, and it's a guide for anyone who's working with people who might experience emotional distress or suicide risk. But it's quite a non-clinical accessible guide, so it's been really well used in sort of job centres, schools, very frontline services. And there's some information on there on why someone might be experiencing emotional distress. So I think the language specifically, we don't have anything on that, although others would, but we were talking within the coalition recently about identifying the need for some sort of guide that would go through what exclusionary practices in schools are, what sort of language isn't helpful. But in terms of who would own that, I'm not sure, but it's definitely one to think about.
Yeah. Yeah, it's certainly something we've given quite a lot of thought to in BCT in terms of access to community services. I don't know if anybody else would like to contribute before I throw in a couple of thoughts on Lisa's question. Because one of the things we're always keen on is to try and make sure that access to support isn't something that people feel that they are kind of specially disadvantaged by doing it. It's something that's available to everybody, that any sort of support is a perfectly normal thing to do, and that you can take it up without identifying yourself as being particularly needy, and so the way you talk about support or indeed just access to activities as something being really a normal thing to do and in very plain language, is something that certainly in terms of community activities we try to work on, and I'd imagine others do as well. I don't think that's particularly special practice. Does anybody else want to add on to Lisa's question?
Chris, can I just say there is something I can mention there leading into what you've asked me to talk about. I'm just aware I've only got about 20 minutes and I've got to go and rescue my gardening group from the rain.
Fair enough. Well, do you want to add it in your presentation then?
Well, just leading on from what Emma has said and what you've just said too, in our experience here at MaesNi, there very much is about the focus needs to be about that compassionate response and about allowing people to feel that there is no stigma attached to coming forward to ask for help. And that's really crucial, really crucial. So we're working as MaesNi in conjunction with various other organisations and services, so ICANN, DWP, CAB, and all of the people working in for those agencies working here. We all have that kind of approach and that joined up sense of trying to provide services that help people deal with the stresses, the significant stresses leading from COVID and now cost of living. So it's been this sort of almost like a consistent sort of period of stress and pressure on people, and we are definitely seeing that impact on people's well-being. So there's specific things to do with mental health through the ICANN worker, there's financial support, there's employment support. Us as an organisation, MaesNi, we're trying to put on activities that provide opportunities for people to connect. This is a big thing we're finding. It's often as simple as opportunities for people to come together, to share, to have a chat, maybe seek some support, but it might also just be through coming together and having a chat. And I think reducing those chances of people becoming isolated and becoming more and more desperate in dealing with these significant pressures that are on people at the moment, that's quite crucial. The other thing I would add to that also is support for staff. We're realising there's a hell of a lot of workload issues. There's a hell of a lot of really quite difficult stuff that we're all dealing with, and it is constant. So in order to best provide support for people within the community, we're also needing to provide support for each other.
Right, thank you. Right, we're on the point of segueing quite nicely into Paul's piece. I think
kind of is it, really.
Yeah. there's more than that. Any final questions for Emma before we move on to Paul? Because what we're going to hear from Paul is more of an indication of what some of the support work looks like at a local level. Paul works, as he mentioned, with MaesNi, which is a community group on the Maesgechen estate in Bangor, which is part of, just funded partly through the Invest Local programme that we're involved with. But there's a whole lot of really interesting partnership work that's developed there across agencies to support local well-being in a whole range of factors. You don't have a presentation, do you, Paul? You just wanted to talk, didn't you?
No, really. So it's just
So,
really basically
case,
what I have just said. And, you know, like, I know Gwen was possibly going to ask questions that might sort of fill in some of the gaps. But essentially, what we've ended up providing here, or attempting to provide here, is support for people across the board with all these different agencies that we got working here, but working in a similar way, which is very much like Emma was saying, that importance of it being destigmatized, breaking down barriers, not about it. You should be ashamed if you ask him for help. You know, and we've got the immediate support stuff we're offering, which is food and fuel support, but we're also trying to put in activities that have more of a well-being approach to them. So some of it's outdoor based, which is my particular remit, doing the gardening, doing a well-being walk group, but also the ICANN worker has just started doing an art therapy session. We've got drop-ins, we've got a coffee morning at the church. Lots of opportunities for people to come together. The Hive Cafe, we're doing 70 meals a week at the moment for the community. You know, it's really taken off in the last sort of 6 weeks, 2 months. And clearly through all of this, what we're doing is through the engagement with people and our interactions with people on a daily basis, is more and more people are presenting with some level of stress and anxiety related to this cost of living crisis, leading on from COVID. Kind of almost feels like it's just this rolling kind of stress that is occurring. And as you said, Emma, quite rightly, this communities like this are hardest hit.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. It's just, yeah, again, that cycle of inequality. It's just the people who are most disadvantaged at the start in terms of suicide risk are now even more worse off. But interesting hearing the different support you're offering, because it's different but similar. This is one of the things we say about supporting people with suicide risk, not specific to poverty, but the same applies. We need to know what people want, but what works for them. So obviously, as with that initial slide, you might have actually seen that slide. Men account for nearly 3/4 of the suicide rates in Wales. But men, from research level, this isn't just my reflection, men don't tend to open up face to face. So the term that's used is shoulder to shoulder. So men are more likely to talk if they're doing an activity like gardening, or, you know, some of the stuff men's sheds get involved in. Men are less likely to open up to another man over a coffee than women are. That's what research says. So in terms of improving mental health support for men, it's really important that we know what works for different people rather than just doing a sort of one size fits all approach. So yeah, it's really interesting to hear the different things that you're doing. Yeah,
that's absolutely the case. And, you know, yeah, men don't open up, do they? You know, and I, speaking as a man, I know that that's a flaw, working on it. But interestingly, just in the last couple of weeks with this new coffee morning we've got going at the church, just purely by chance, 2 of the men who attend that, one is recently widowed, the other one has been a widower for a few years. They've connected, and actually it's been really interesting to see that they've created a bond, and that has arisen from a conversation that we had as part of our community engagement, where somebody said, oh, there used to be coffee mornings in the church. Immediately somebody who's connected with the church said, that's no problem, we can open the church up and you can use the church on a Wednesday morning. We've started facilitating that, and out of that there's been this connection forged between these 2 particular men, but also other people in that group. And what we're finding is that we're not specifically doing anything that is specifically suicide prevention. We're doing things that are trying to help people deal with the pressures and the stresses that they're under, some of which, as I say, is an immediate kind of sticking plaster, help with some food, help with some fuel, but other stuff, and we're finding the things that are most effective are actually just providing opportunities for people to gather together and connect and chat. And that might just be that specific moment when they've had a chat and a panad and a cake for an hour and a half might actually fit the purpose, and it might actually make those people feel a little bit better about things they've been able to share. But it might also be that through those conversations and our presence, we can identify that somebody might need further support, and then we can do that thing where we signpost and direct. I mean, one thing the ICANN worker who has been doing some great work since she's been imposed, she said to me the other day they've had to suspend referrals for her because she is already overloaded. So that's an indication of how much of an issue this is. So at the moment, our capacity, and hers in particular as the ICANN worker, is overloaded.
Sorry, Paul, can you just explain what the ICANN worker is for those who aren't familiar with
So
it?
she's a community sort of mental health support. So anything from stress and anxiety, relationships, work, anything like that. She gets some referrals through the community mental health team, some informally. She does some individual work with people. She also puts on a range of activities like the art therapy's just started, the drop-in session in the youth club. So she's got a whole range of things that she's trying to put in place to support people.
And I guess it's probably worth mentioning the ICANN project. It's a health board initiative, isn't it, originally? So it's in North Wales, it's the Betsy Cadwallader Health Board. So MaesNi, the organisation that Paul works for, were asked to host the you've called it a support hub, really, haven't you, in MaesNi?
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to kind of point out that's partly kind of facilitated all these lovely networks that you've got with talking about the DWP and CAB and then the ICANN worker. Because I've just been writing up a bit of a kind of case study from the stuff that you and Jess are doing on this, and it's kind of really apparent that you've looked at what works for the community in terms of who the links are you need. And I think also quite clearly it's you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, Paul, but it's the approach, isn't it, which you mentioned before, of those staff members of being very non-judgmental.
Totally, absolutely, it has been, really significant. And we just have found ourselves with a team of people that all work in the same sort of way, and we know that that is the best, most effective way to provide that non-judgmental, compassionate approach.
I think it's also kind of one of the really big learning things in MaesNi that's happened since COVID, actually, as well, in terms of the approach there has been the food and fuel help you were talking about. It really, when people kind of walk in the door for that, they know that there's no judgment there at all, is there? Because people don't have to fill in a form in or prove why they need it or anything like that, do they? And that I think has been really significant, hasn't it?
It's all trust-based, and I think people really appreciate that. And in actual fact, we have very few incidences where that's abused, and it genuinely is people asking for help and knowing that when they come and ask for help, they're not going to be judged. They're not going to be, criticised or questioned or challenged over it. It's just, we're here to help. That's fine.
And I just kind of feel that's like a really good, strong foundation, isn't it, that where you've started from in terms of the relationship. I was just going to ask you in terms of Dell's role, the ICANN worker. So does she, she can kind of then does she refer on from her when people come?
She can do, yes, she can do. So we sort of, we either link in with each other. So with Vicky for Citizens Advice or Mel for DWP or ourselves, and we're also, so in my role as a community environment worker, I've been involved in this fledgling organisation, the Wales Outdoor Health Network, which is being overseen by Coed Creole. I had a meeting with Lauren yesterday, who was the Coed Creole Wellbeing worker up here. That is going to expand and open up. It's a brilliant initiative that is then going to provide a wide-ranging number of opportunities for social prescribing. So that's something that Dell will be able to also work alongside that initiative. And if there's a wellbeing walk happening somewhere, it may well be that she's got somebody who she says, this is going to be useful for you. Would you like to join that? Or a gardening group or a woodland activity session. So that whole outdoor side of stuff is going to really take off, and I think going to be really, really useful. And that's a a great initiative. I think it's a Welsh Assembly initiative. I think Caerphilly are administering that, but it's a great initiative.
And Paul, how does it, there's kind of people coming in, isn't there, from the, in kind of almost crisis point, coming in, accessing support. And then you've got people coming in from just wanting to connect, in terms of activities. How do they meet or link or layer up?
Sorry, Gwen, what was the question?
I suppose, I'm conscious there's kind of almost two things happening, but they're very, very linked. So
they are. I think essentially it's coming from a point of us being available and us being approachable, that people coming in for that whole range of things. Maybe they want to be involved with a group, or they want to do a particular activity or come along to the drop-in or whatever, right the way up to people who need really specific intervention and service support. So there's that whole range of things that we can provide, some of it ourselves, then through some of the agencies that we have working on the estate, we can signpost to them, but it also can go up to the next level. So I know that Dell can also refer people up into the mental health team, for example. So there's that whole range of outcomes that are possible.
Yeah, and I think that's really that's been really valuable, isn't it? Because I think that stuff was coming through, wasn't it, before, and then we didn't have that connection, did we? In terms of being able to refer it. And I think one thing that really stands out for me, and in some of the other areas as well, is this, around the cost of living crisis, is the bringing people together and that it's in a positive celebratory way. It's not about the cost of living crisis, but it's about connecting. And that it just gives that lovely it helps with that kind of non-judgmental thing, doesn't it, I suppose?
Totally. It's got, we're pitching these things with a positive slant, that it's opportunities to get together and to bond and connect and chat and share. It's not about, we're not saying these are, places and opportunities to come to sort of all sort of drown each other in your misery. It's that kind of, the approach is to say, look, let's get together. Things are tough, but you know what? We're all in it together. And that has been something here at MaesNi that is really significant, is the capacity within this community to support one another. That was evident in COVID, and it's evident now, is huge. So we, as workers here, really are just facilitating what is already here, but also providing specific services and advice and support that can come through these different organisations.
And there's one other question I was just going to raise, just asking you really to share, Paul. You touched upon it a little bit about how you support each other as a staff team and volunteer, when you're dealing with very difficult. We've sort of, it's quite difficult because we don't all work the same hours, so we're not always physically present at the same time. But wherever possible, we try and grab time to catch up with each other. And again, it's normally around a cup of tea or coffee and a biscuit or something. But and a couple of times we've actually sort of gone to a slightly different physical place, because if we're in the office or if we're in the youth club, there's constant flow of people. And that's not to say that we're no longer present and available to provide people with support, but it is important for us to also sort of withdraw from it a little bit and to actually be able to catch up. Some of those conversations are professional, some of those conversations about specific things that we are dealing with, that we need to share information about particular people or groups. Some of it is offloading our own stuff, and that's been valid too, because we all have lives too, we all have stuff going on. So sometimes it's important for us to be able to know that it's okay to share that too. And we haven't done it on a fixed formal way. We're doing it on a sort of a rolling kind of informal, whenever there's an opportunity to do that. Sometimes it's for 20 minutes, sometimes it's for an hour, and we're finding that's really necessary, really important.
Thank you very much. I'm aware you've got to get back to the gardening group shortly, so
they'll be pretty upset if I don't turn up and make them a panad.
I don't know how horrendous. Yes, I'm hearing Cardiff.
I've got 5 minutes if anybody does have any questions.
That's what I want to do. It's a chance for any quick questions to Paul from what's been a really, really interesting insight to work in Bangor.
I was just wondering how much flack you're going to get, Paul, for avoiding the rain this morning.
Well, we started at 9 this morning and it was just windy and it wasn't wet. And I did make a comment about how we had been very fortunate recently with our outdoor sessions. And then as soon as I came in to do this, it's poured down. So yeah, and it's dry again now. So they'll be saying I did it on purpose. Yeah, that's okay. Broad shoulders, I can take the flack.
Can I ask a quick question if nobody else has got one for now? We talked quite a lot about men's mental health already, and I think somebody was mentioning Men's Shed, which I've seen again have been very useful for allowing people to share how they feel. I just wondered if you and MaesNi has been anything specifically done with younger men.
There is. We've recently just had a youth worker appointed here after a few years of not having anybody. They're working with young men between 17 and 25 specifically. Started a drop-in session here. We also have a community member, Owen, who has been doing some dads and lads stuff and providing opportunities for young people to do creative things. He does a lot of work with music and rapping and recording, but that's, you know, he's doing that as a he provides those opportunities through sort of working, getting funding and providing opportunities for specific programs and events that he does. It is definitely an area that we need more of. I've recently had a discussion with Gwynedd Council and Nature Partnerships, who have finally come through with some funding to do some environmental work here, some of which will be practical conservation, woodland management down in the Kegging woodland. And I've suggested that that would definitely fit the bill for young men. I think that would ideally, like you say, Emma, that shoulder to shoulder approach. I think doing some practical conservation work, certainly that's how I got into conservation years ago as a troubled teen doing conservation work with BTCV. That steered me down that path. So I know the value of that, absolutely. So hopefully that will happen in the new year.
Great, thanks, Paul. Any other questions for Paul? To delay his return to the rain.
It stopped raining now, it's fine.
So you're lucky.
I'm happy, I'm all good, I'm dry, I'm okay.
Anyway, in that case, I think we'll let you go, especially if it stopped raining. Thank you very much. A really interesting contribution as ever. Yeah, best of luck with really important work.
Thank you very much. Cheers. Appreciate it. Okay. See you.
All right. Thanks a lot, Paul.
Bye.
What we're going to do now is to move on to the more discursive element of this. I'm just going to share my screen again. What we're going to do is to look at a couple. I think there's probably enough people to have a couple of groups, so there's more chance to discuss. So really, a couple of things we're asking. What's going on in your communities that are worth sharing with other people, and what are the gaps from where you stand locally, and both of those will be really good to hear about. In terms of the positive notes, it would be really great to hear about things we can share with others, and if there are gaps, are the things that we can make sure that we potentially address in future sessions, or by sharing information directly with you. Mark's also posted the questions in the chat, and we'll make sure they get posted in the chat in the different groups. Very quickly before we finish, I just wondered if there were any notable points that came out of the two groups. And I don't know, was there a facilitator in group one?
Gwen was there. Gwen's a facilitator.
I was there. We all facilitated pretty well, I think. And Emma said she'd feedback actually, but I'm sure I'll check in.
Yeah, we weren't really well behaved because we didn't really answer the questions, although we did in a roundabout way. But we were just carrying on from the question that came up earlier on around, is there an actual guide on, or best practice on what language could be used and how to, lessen the stigma? And really that is a gap. We said that we need some sort of, it's not just a guide on language, but it's a way in which we encourage systems and public services to think about inequality from the outset, and so they develop systems that don't exclude, you know, things like, just for reference, I was saying things like, I discussed with the Anti-Poverty Alliance recently that they were talking about a consortium of schools where children had access to counsellors in their lunch break, but those claiming free school meals had to be in the cafeteria at the same time, and there's no way they could do both. So things like that could probably be remedied quite simply by considering those sort of facts early on. So it's not, it is the language, but I think it's a whole sort of approach that needs developing. So yeah, I sort of said we need to do it. I think we should do it. But, yeah.
That was interesting, actually. But when the socioeconomic duty came in, I can't remember when that was. It was during COVID, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The Bevan Foundation said exactly that point needed to be done for it to work. And I suspect.
Yeah. I don't think it is.
No, exactly. That was exactly what I was about to say. Anything else from that? Sorry,
again, I tend to have a bit of an, you know, I think that was great and we welcomed it. But in terms of actual grassroots or local communities or public services on the ground, I think they just need a very accessible guide rather than, you know, comprehensive high level advice in order to make it work. It's one thing to say you need to do this, but people need to know how, especially when they're very stretched as it is. And that's the thing we find with a lot of the professions we engage with. It's not that they don't want to do it, but they need it to be very accessible for them to do it. We can't expect them to, you need to do this, go and crack on and find it yourselves when they're already under constraint. So yeah.
Thank you. That's really helpful. That's really something for organisations working at national level to take away and work on, actually, because that's going to have some degree of coordination of people working together on that. Anything else from that group? Gwen, Emma?
I don't think so. I think, yeah, it was that there was a lot of talking about a lack of awareness in terms of language, attitude. I think the stuff we referred to in terms of treating people compassionately, lots of the systems are set up not to, aren't they? And that creates a certain culture and then stops people accessing services. And, you know, poverty was the main focus there around kind of people's attitudes towards poverty, and just really a lot of people in roles that are meant to be supporting people, but really, because they've never experienced poverty themselves, have no understanding that, you know, the kind of the reality of it, really. And so we did talk a bit about sharing stories and the importance of that with those people.
This is really timely in a way, because I mean, Mark and I have been having some discussions with WLGA and a couple of other organisations about doing some events on this topic, but deliberately across sectors after the new year. And actually, this is a really important message to put into that audience. The power of truth coming from the people experiencing it, really, as well. Yeah. Although I'd imagine that the likes of Lynn and Carrie see both sides being working within local authorities as well. Brendan, did you want to say anything from the group you were facilitating?
Yeah, I do. I mean, but before I do that, just to come on to the point you've just made, I've done some work recently with the Cymru Morgannwg Health Board, which cuts across sort of, you know, a number of areas, and they've done a lot of work on co-production and engagement and getting hold of that lived experience, which is really, really useful because they're rolling that forward. I was involved with the population needs and well-being assessments, but there seems to be a realization that it's not about, you know, every 5 years you do it. You constantly have that dialogue with communities. And I think there's, you know, I'm optimistic that moving forward, there'll be a lot more feeding into the, you know, the squillions of pounds that are spent on health and well-being, you know, that actually involve lived experiences. Our group had a really interesting discussion, kind of looking at RCT. I'm in the Merthyr area, Pembrokeshire, and Bridgend, Chris, because you're working in kind of that area. And it was really interesting, the different things that are happening at a kind of a council level in terms of support from local authorities. We had people in the group who are responsible for food and food distribution, food banks, pantries, that kind of thing. And we've also got various sorts of schemes involving energy, fuel poverty, that kind of area. And we had a bit of a discussion about what's going on in different areas. Kind of the areas that we maybe picked up on in terms of gaps was communication, and how we actually kind of make sure that the actual beneficiaries of what's available know about them. And I know that in RCT, they're doing some fantastic things by bringing up, you know, particular individuals and making sure that there are kind of, you know, well-being assessments done around them. But in my area, I know we struggle because there's a mismatch between potentially, you know, what community coordinators, either in the council or in third sector groups, are doing and what's actually kind of getting through. And I know in our community, we're looking at kind of, you know, physical notice boards. But I heard yesterday that our council will be using its Connect newsletter to kind of outline all the cost of living things. And I think, Chris, you posted something about what's happening from a newsletter point of view. But the communication thing is a bit of a gap because, you know, lots of people are missing out because they just don't know what's available. But kind of from a theory point of view, there's stuff available. So people assume it's getting to where it needs to go. I think there was a really good point made by Rachel about trust. And, you know, some people don't actually believe that these offers are real and genuine, given scams and things that are out there. And therefore, kind of what can we do to try and kind of tackle that and raise awareness of, you know, what's genuine and what isn't, what should be trusted, what shouldn't be trusted. I think kind of Lynn's made some points there about train the trainer and some stuff that's available, but it's clearly something that, you know, we need to think about because as Emma said earlier, that, you know, there are a lot of vulnerable people out there. They're under a lot of stress. You know, resilience is not something that kind of comes naturally. So, you know, there's a lot of difficulty in making sure that people take the help that's available to them. And I don't know how that's going to pan out. We will find out.
Thank you, Brendan. Emma, you mentioned the trainer stuff in your presentation as well. Is there information we can share on that when we share your presentation as well?
Do you mean about us delivering awareness?
Yes.
Yeah, so I'll attach the slides, but also the 2 resources. Actually, we've got 3 because this year we also, just for reference, we released a guide called Finding Your Way, and that's for someone who's struggling to cope, and it's from people who've noticed like a dip in their well-being through to people who are actively suicidal, and it's got a lot of signposted. So I'll share all of those. And I was just saying in our group that it's free and run by our volunteers, so it takes a little while to arrange, not ages, but our volunteers can do sort of online awareness sessions where they'll run through the resource with people and just take questions, but it's not a formulated easy thing. It relies on, there's 10 locations in Wales, 10 branches, so chances are we'll get someone to deliver it. But yeah, I'll send all the details. That was a long-winded way of saying yes, I'll send the details.
Thank you, but some caveats on how fast it can be done, understandable.
Yeah.
After the meeting, I will share a digital goodie bag on Chris's behalf. So I'll wait for Emma to send over her things and pop a few details down about MaesNi and ICANN and all the other links that we talked about today.
Yeah. And talking of digital goodie bags, if I didn't share this one with you, Mark wouldn't forgive me, as it's one of his technological whizzes that we can actually see other events on the QR code. So we'd also really appreciate your feedback on this event and how useful you found it. I'd like to thank our 2 speakers. Paul's obviously gone, but Emma, who's stayed with us all the time. It's been really, really interesting discussion. I've found it very useful. I hope you have too, and stimulated ideas about what people need to do next. Our next event in this series is on the 6th of December, which is on warm hubs, which I appreciate are being given different names in different places. But this is an interesting area because it's one of the few bits of work that's actually new. We haven't thought about warm welcomes or warm centres in quite the same way before. So there should be some really interesting sharing and learning to be done there. And I think it's a dynamic area with lots of new things being tried all the time. If you get, I know in our group we talked about some of the financial help available to people already, and a lot of you are really aware of it. So, but please share that if it's relevant to people you're working with. And as I said before, if you're interested in being involved in Community Movement Cymru, the links were in the chat. Thank you very much for getting involved today, and I hope to see you all soon in one category or another. Thanks very much.